Hello, my name is Nicolas and I am a professor at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Today, I'm going to talk about security engineering and the fact that it is, in fact, an interdisciplinary science. Perhaps you may wonder, what is security? And actually, I'd like to return the question to you. What is security? Some of you might know security through some of its properties. For instance, confidentiality, the act of making certain that information is kept secret to all but the parties that are supposed to know about it. Perhaps you think of security as integrity, the act of making sure that data is not destroyed by adverse or malicious means while in transit. But really, security is a lot more than just one property or the other. It's a combination. And perhaps it makes sense to look at security in a more holistic fashion. So let me just bring up two definitions that I think are extremely interesting and relevant to today's discussion. For Ross Anderson, who is a professor at Cambridge University in the United Kingdom and the author of Security Engineering, the book Security Engineering, security is essentially building systems to remain dependable in the face of malice, error, or mischance. So it's a very systems-oriented view of things. For Anderson, the idea is that implementing security is itself part of building a system. It's really something that is inherent to this notion of building a system. Adrian Perig, who is now a professor at ETH Zurich in Switzerland and was one of the founding faculty behind Carnegie Mellon Scilab, has a slightly different take. For Perig, security is about managing a malicious adversary and guaranteeing properties even if that malicious adversary tries to attack. Very different perspective, as you can see. For Perig, security is about managing an opponent. So for Anderson, it's about building systems. For Perig, managing an opponent. Who is right? Well, both of them are. And that's the thing. Both of these definitions are equally valid. Security is very hard to define. You basically know it when you see it. But those two definitions actually encompass most of what we mean by saying that we're studying and devising security engineering. So let me start also by showing you some examples of what is not security, or what are some security problems. Let's look at this. This is a typical example of what we call the weakest link. An actual weakest link, a physical weakest link. You have an extremely sturdy and solid, albeit a bit rusty, chain link here with a scary looking padlock. Unfortunately, if you look carefully, you realize that this very sturdy chain link has a bit of a problem here that was fixed by using a 200 yen piece of plastic. What would an attacker do? Do you really think they're going to go after the padlock? Do you really think they're going to go after the metallic chain? No, what they will do is take maybe even a plastic knife will do the trick, but a very small knife or a pair of scissors, cut this link and open this door. So here, the security engineer would immediately see this and say, this is not secure. The security of this whole contraption, however sturdy it may look, is equivalent to the security of that plastic link. There's no security at all. This door is as good as open. Of course, it's very easy to see this in an example like this. But very often, this little plastic link would be hidden. It wouldn't be necessarily obvious to see that something like this is happening. And that's what makes security systems engineering difficult. Here is another slightly different example. So here we have a very nice bicycle, and it's perhaps a little bit hard to see, but there is an actual chain here which is very sturdy, very resilient, a pole to which the bicycle is attached which is equally resilient. You probably need an axe to take this thing down. But what the person who owns the bike here failed to realize is that certainly the bike is valuable, but it's not the only thing that is valuable. The wheels, perhaps the brakes, the tires, and so forth are also valuable, and they were not protected. The only thing that is protected here is the frame. The bicycle as a whole is not. It's one element of the bicycle that is protected, not the entire thing. As a result, well, as you can see, the bike has been stripped down, and there's no wheels anymore, the brakes are gone. Interestingly, the saddle is still here, but this bike is now unusable, and a number of important components have been stolen. So that's another aspect of security that we need to take into account. It's not just looking at a security vulnerability that can impact the whole system, but it's also looking at security vulnerabilities that can impact parts of the system, or parts of the system are not protected at all. So as I said earlier, security engineering is a bit hard to define, and sometimes it is defined as a set of properties. And I might have been a bit dismissive when saying that security is not just about confidentiality, it's not just about privacy, it's not just about anonymity. But those are important primitives. And we usually want to express what security is for a given context in terms of the properties that we want to enforce. So for instance, the security property of the bike could have been maintaining the integrity of the bicycle while at the same time making sure it is not stolen. Well, the integrity property was not met. So some of the properties that we find very often when talking about security engineering are listed on this slide. Confidentiality and privacy. What's the difference between the two? Well, confidentiality is about making sure that somebody else's data is not revealed to unauthorized parties. For instance, when I grade my students' work, only a given student can have access to their own grades. The other students should not. I'm preserving the confidentiality of those records. Privacy is the same thing, but a bit twisted, turned around on its head. It's the act of protecting your own information. For instance, I am not going to reveal you my age because I want to maintain my privacy, so I'm protecting my own information. Integrity means that one wants to protect the integrity of a message, for instance, or a communication or of an entity, by making sure that between the source and the destination, while it's in transit, or between two different points in time, it has not been modified by unauthorized means. So essentially a preservation of the structure and the integrity, the physical integrity of a piece of data or an artifact. Authentication and identification, those are actually very important properties. They essentially ensure that in the context of communications in particular, the issuer of a message is really who they claim to be. There are some subtle details. Authentication actually could be the subject of many lectures just by itself, but essentially it's a matter of making sure that the origin of a message is really who they claim to be. Anonymity is perhaps to some extent a subset of privacy that has to deal with identities. In anonymity, you want to ensure that the identity of all but the authorized parties are kept hidden from the rest of the world. certification, non-repudiation, timestamping, those are also other properties that may not necessarily come to mind when we are talking about security properties, but that are also important. And this slide is by no means exhaustive. Essentially, the security properties that you want to achieve are going to be defined when you're looking at a given system and you know which resources you want to protect, and you essentially define a list of those properties. Those are your objectives. And it's important to realize that those, again, are objectives. Encryption, for instance, is not a security property. It's a tool, it's a mathematical tool that enables you, that allows you to enforce some of those properties. Encryption might be useful in ensuring confidentiality, privacy, integrity, authentication, anonymity. But by itself, it is not a goal. What about security engineering? Well, security engineering reflects the notion that security itself is a process. It's not something that you can buy. It is not something that you can just tack on to a problem. You cannot go to the supermarket and purchase security. Perhaps some of the advertisements that you hear would, to some extent, reflect that idea that you can actually purchase security. But you really can't. It's really a matter of, I would say, almost human resources. You need to have engineers. You need to have people who are integrating security as part of the design process. Much like when you're designing, say, a bridge or a car, you've got a whole list of things that go into the design process. The conception, the design itself, the engineering, the decisions about which type of tools to use and so forth. Security should be part of that design. And so this is really something that needs to be engineered at system design time. We are in Japan, and I'm actually giving this lecture from Kobe. In 1995, there was a big earthquake here, and a lot of buildings collapsed. So Japanese people are very, very well aware of security in the context of civil engineering. If you want to purchase a new apartment nowadays in Japan, one of the main selling points from the brochures that I've seen is how earthquake resilient they are by having the earthquake resilience being built in the building as it was designed. For instance, the foundations are on springs so that the building can shake but not bend or break in case of an earthquake. And this is exactly the way to think about security. This is a great analogy because there is nothing fundamentally different between civil engineering security and computer security. You're building systems and you need to design security at design time. It's very hard to put security back into a product or a project or a system when the system has already been designed. Much like it is very hard to put back, to retrofit earthquake resilience in an existing building, it's very hard to put back security in something that was not designed with security in mind. So one problem that civil engineers face is when you're dealing with historical buildings that are 200, 300 years old sometimes, and that are in earthquake-prone zones. How do you actually put something in the building so that it doesn't collapse in case there's an earthquake? It's very, very hard, and talk to any civil engineer and they will tell you how difficult it is. And very often it's extremely difficult, and it's not necessarily extremely, well, I wouldn't say effective, but you do not get necessarily the best security guarantees that you can get. So for instance, if you think about the Bay Bridge in California, which is a bridge that connects San Francisco to an area known as the East Bay. That's Berkeley and Oakland. The Bay Bridge had two spans. One connecting San Francisco to an island in the middle of the bay called Treasure Island, and one connecting Treasure Island to the East Bay, Berkeley and Oakland. It was decided that it would be just too difficult to retrofit that span of the bridge with good, strong earthquake resilient mechanisms, and that even if this was done, notwithstanding the cost that was already extremely high, the earthquake resilience wouldn't be that great. So what did people do? They destroyed that half and rebuilt another one. Very often you have to do that when something has not been engineered with security from the get-go. And we see this in computer systems as well. We see this in information systems as well. A lot of operating systems were not designed with security in mind. Think about DOS. Think about Windows 95, for instance. There was no security threat, really. Computers at the time were not necessarily connected on networks. It was still very rare. Most of them were single-user, single-process computers. And so you really didn't have any competition or anything. And the problem is that because we tend to have an evolutionary nature where the next piece of software builds on the previous piece of software, and you want to have backwards compatibility. Some of those design assumptions that were made in the early 80s were still foundational to some software that was used in the 2000s, when the landscape had completely changed, with computers being interconnected, being multi-user, multi-process, and so forth. The internet is another great example. When the internet was designed, the vision was that the US Army was going to be the user of the internet. You have to travel back in time to the 1960s to actually get a bit of the mindset. So the mindset was, we're going to build this communication network, and we are going to build it so that the military of the United States and civilian command can talk to each other, even in case of an attack. Who was the attacker at the time? Well, again, travel back in time, it's the 1960s, potential attackers are the USSR. People who are outside of the network, who may be able to bomb some of the infrastructure. So the idea was, let's make the routing, let's make all of this infrastructure very resilient to potential external attacks. And the internet was remarkably designed for that objective, which is why if somebody trips a switch in the closet in this building, we probably, well, maybe not in this building, but at the Network Operations Center a few miles away from here, we probably still will have internet connectivity because there is resilience and redundancy in the routes, and we can route around failures. So the internet completely achieves its objective. There's just one problem. Why is the internet so insecure, to hear what people are saying? Well, it's because the assumption was that everybody on the internet would be part of the US Army or trusted entities such as US universities. Everybody would be benevolent. Fast forward 50 years to 2010. Everybody is on the internet. Yesterday's political foes are on the internet. The Russians are on the internet. They're not interested in attacking it from the outside. They're actually making business on it. Everybody is on the internet. So now you have potential malicious actors that are actually part of the network. And the internet was not designed at all. At least originally, it was not designed to withstand essentially what has become insider attacks. And as a result, some decisions that were made back in the 60s, now we look back on them and say, what did these people think? Why is there absolutely no authentication, for instance, when looking at IP addresses? Well, there was no authentication because everybody was supposed to be nice and playing along. But it's not necessarily the case now. So let's take a step back and let's talk about security analysis. As a security engineer, if, say, I am commissioned to evaluate a system and to design, to actually provide some sort of report to say, you know, this is how you secure this system, there are three questions that I start by asking. The first one is, what is the target system? What do you want me to protect? What are the assets? And what is their value as well? That's the first thing. The second thing that I need to define is, who are the adversaries? I need to be able to know who are the attackers, but that's not the only thing. I I need to also know what are the attacker's resources and the probability of an attack. You can always say, well, your attacker is the strongest possible attacker. They have almost infinite resources. Maybe a nation state is after you. But what's the probability that a nation state is going to attack you? Well, I would say it depends on the target. If the target system is a secret that you want to keep from your little sister, I would venture to guess that no nation state is particularly interested in this. And so the probability of attack would be zero. So it's very important to know these two quantities. The third one is what I referred to earlier as security properties. You can also think of it as security requirements. What do you want to have? Do you want to implement confidentiality, integrity, authenticity, anonymity, any other security property? A subset of those, all of them, you're going to have to make choices. And just saying, well, we want it to be secure does not mean anything. You need to specify it better. Only when you have answered those three questions can you start thinking about security approaches. And this is where I want to draw a very important point. It's not just about technology. It's not just about implementing the latest crypto library or the latest patch. There's a lot more to it than that. You can use social norms. For instance, we don't go around killing people. Why? Because for 99% of people, killing other people is not something that is socially acceptable behavior. And so that already rules out the 99% of people who are not psychopaths. We don't have to defend against those. We know that they're fine. Legal enforcement is also another tool that you may have at your disposal. We don't go around killing people, even though some of us may be psychopathic, just because we don't want to go to jail. Right? So that rules out another group of people. Economics. Make the attack too costly to carry out. For instance, if an attacker needs to invest $1 million yen to break into a safe, right? $10,000, $1 million yen, give or take, to break into a safe that contains absolutely nothing of value, do you really think that the attacker is going to do it? Well, they may, but even if they do, then that leads to their ruin, which is actually a good outcome for the defender. But more likely than not, they just won't even bother, because they also know what is the target that they want to attack. Economics is not just necessarily about monetary costs. Time is also something that costs. Maybe not directly to yen or to dollars, but time is something that needs to be taken into account. Reputation costs, and so forth. And all of these are things that we talk about a lot when describing security engineering. Now, this is not to say that technological approaches are not important. There will always be bad people around, and we need to find ways of keeping them at bay. When economics, legal, social norms fail, we still need to have some technology in place to repel people. And that's where things like cryptography, firewalls come in place. But we shouldn't think about those as being the only technological means of defense. There are other means as well that are complementary, such as redundancy. Have the same asset be cloned, if you will, so that if some of those assets are being taken down, that's okay, there is a backup, right? A route from A to B, if it's shut down, you can't go from A to B. Build a second route between A and B. Build a third route. Detection. Figuring out what is happening and whether your attacker is attacking can be used as a feed to the legal system, in fact. Preemptive strike is perhaps a little bit more egregious. Attack the attacker before they attack you. But that's been actually used as a potential defensive mechanism. not necessarily the best one, not necessarily the most socially acceptable one, but for the sake of completeness, I listed here. And recovery. Recovery is extremely important. Even if you design your system to be very secure, even if you manage to ensure that you're repeating 99% of the attacks, you probably will never be sure that you can repeat 100% of the attacks. And you need to be prepared to deal with that 1% case where everything else has fallen or has failed. So it's important to have, whenever you can, backups and insurance. As a security engineer, I'm a professor in security, the contents of my laptop, this presentation, is backed up in many different places. The backups are encrypted. People do not have access to them, but I have copies of this very presentation on at least 5 different systems as we speak. Why? Because I know that if I go on the train and I forget my laptop behind me, well, it's annoying. I lose the value of the laptop, but I don't lose any of the data on it because I have it backed up. And also, I don't think that people will be able to access the data itself because it's protected by encryption. So it's important to have backups in case everything else fails. What kind of experts do we need when building systems? Well, secure system building, of course, comprises things like networking, cryptography. Secure system design also includes software engineering. You probably have to cut on this one. Secure system building includes, of course, things like networking, cryptography, software engineering. But as I discussed earlier, this is not the only thing. You also need to take into account economics, management and policy, psychology, and many other fields. So any security engineering curriculum or security engineering course needs to take all of those aspects into consideration. In fact, it's very important to think about security as a cross-disciplinary problem, where you need experts in each of those domains. Not just experts in each of those domains, but experts that can talk the same language across domains. And that's very important. It's very important to have people who both understand cryptography and network security, of course. It's very important to have people who understand both networking and software engineering. It's also equally important to have people who understand both networking and economics, for instance. Most of the failures in current systems are not necessarily pure technological breaks. There's a lot of that, as we've seen with recent attacks on SSL and others, but very often you're going to have, for instance, a problem between a cryptographic primitive, which is very secure, but is not used in the way that it was designed for. And that's what we call interface failures. Most security failures come from interfaces between domains. Usability problems are at the boundary between psychology and software engineering. They are one of the main causes of security vulnerabilities. Let me give you a few examples of what I mean by examples of interface failure. Undisclosed number of Verizon employees at risk of identity theft. The employees store confidential information in the laptops because it's easier for them. They can take the work home and be productive 24 hours a day. There's no policy about laptop use. A laptop is stolen. And then all of these security mechanisms that you've deployed at the company, firewalls, access control, and so forth, they're all for nothing because somebody took a laptop out and that laptop got stolen. That's an example of interface failure. Very poor interaction between the policy that completely forgot laptop use and human factors. People want flexibility, and just because they have to do their job. Here is another example of an interface failure. the traditional phishing scam, where somebody purporting to be a bank emails you and tells you that you've got to log in somewhere because something absolutely horrible happened to you and they want to help you. The twist here is that this is actually a fairly advanced phishing example. If you look at this email, you see in the middle a link to trustedbank.com. You've taken an anti-phishing class, you have followed some training, and you look at this link and you say, well, it looks actually correct. This is probably not a phishing email. Why? Well, I noticed that it is going to trustedbank.com, and also it is even using HTTPS, which means that the transaction is going to be secure. Or is it? Well, this may be an HTML email. And if you look at the HTML code, which most people wouldn't, you realize that the link is indeed to HTTPS, www.trustedbank.com, and so forth, but that is actually not at all where the traffic is going to go. It's going to go to HTTPS, www.hacker.com. Most users would not realize this. In fact, it's pretty much impossible to notice this unless your mouse is hovering over this and you're paying attention to where you're going. What is even worse is that it is using HTTPS. Your communication is going to be encrypted and secure. And secure, I would say. Confidentiality of the communication is going to be completely maintained. The only problem is you're not going to be talking to the bank. You're going to have a very, very secure, very confidential communication with the attacker. So that's a second example of interface failure. All of the cryptography that is happening behind the scenes here is working just fine. You don't need to break SSL to do this. It's actually doing exactly what it's supposed to do. But the failure here is that the user does not realize that they are not talking to the right person. Here is a third example of an interface failure. You might have heard about distributed denial of service attacks. And they typically work as follows. A bunch of machines are hired around the internet to send small amounts of traffic, all converging toward the victim. So essentially what happens is that all of those machines send a little bit of traffic, and that traffic accumulates, and eventually all gets to the same victim, which succumbs under the weight of the traffic. A good idea to solve this, if we completely ignore any monetary considerations, would be to filter the traffic before it even gets in the network. We deploy defenses, we put some sort of firewall, if you will, in front of all of these machines. This is perfect. Not only the victim is immune to the attack, but it's even better than that. The network itself as a whole does not receive any nefarious traffic. Everybody is happy, right? But there's a problem here. Who pays for this? Well, it's on this network, so presumably this person is paying for this, that person is paying for this one, and so forth. But who benefits from it? Primarily the victim. What's the incentive for these people to actually purchase some expensive equipment so that it benefits from somebody else? The internet is not a charity in general. The entities that are running those machines are here to make money. Why would they purchase something like this? It can only work if everybody in the network agrees to do the same thing and to have reciprocal agreements. But that's really hard to do. The other thing is that it's even worse than that. If you deploy something like this, a firewall, and you are a little bit too aggressive, and you start discarding traffic from your customers, legitimate customers, they're going to go away, they're going to go somewhere else. So, not only did you invest, but you actually, in addition to this investment, you might also lose revenue because your customers are going somewhere else if you're filtering them too aggressively. There is no incentive for these people to actually deploy this solution. So an engineer would come up with this and say, scientifically, this is probably the best way to deal with this. An economist would tell you, no, that doesn't work, because the money needs to flow from here to there, and that's very hard to do. And because it's very hard to do, that's one of the reasons why it's rarely done. And without those economic incentives, you don't solve the problem. So I want to emphasize that security engineering is really a science where we need collaboration between experts from different fields. We need people who are able to talk across fields, people who understand multiple aspects of a problem. And that doesn't prevent them from being an expert in one topic. You can understand psychology while being a network security specialist. But security is hard because you need both depth and breadth of knowledge. And this is something that at Carnegie Mellon, in our courses, we reflect in both our teaching and our research. We try really hard to address both of those aspects. So let me give you an example of an introductory security course that we're teaching at Carnegie Mellon, and that may be of interest to some of these audience. The topics range from cryptography, policy, network security, and security and human factors. We start by looking at security of isolated hosts. They might have software vulnerabilities. They might need some cryptography also to be able to preserve confidentiality of information. But they're essentially systems in isolation. And we start from there because that's where we see the fundamentals of security engineering. But those machines are typically not in isolation. They're connected to each other. And by connecting them, we introduce potential network vulnerabilities that we also have to address. But we don't stop there. We also look at the human aspects, policy and decision making, that may actually impact how these different machines talk to each other. As an example of what we do, this is the type of homework that we had in this class. It's a bit controversial, but a good way to teach people about defenses is by teaching offense. And in one of the homeworks, for instance, that we're used to doing, we actually have people break into systems. They are not breaking into the school systems or anything like that. We give them a virtual machine, a synthetic system, if you will, and we tell them, okay, break into this. It's very much the same as being in a laboratory doing chemical experiments and just trying to come up with some result in chemistry or physics. It's very experiment-driven, and it gives people a good sense and a good appreciation for what it means to actually get into a system. And if you do this, then people understand much better what the attack is. Then they can think about the defense itself. They know how they manage to penetrate the system, and that teaches them much better how to defend against such penetrations. There's nothing better for a software engineer to understand buffer overflow than to actually exploit a buffer overflow. Believe me, people who go through this exercise will think twice before not checking array bounds next time they program something. Another example that I wanted to introduce is that of anonymous networks. This is something that we cover in class, and we cover, of course, the technical side, which involves public key cryptography and symmetric key cryptography as well. And we look at it from a very systems-oriented perspective. But we also look at it from a public policy perspective. Both aspects are extremely important. In the context of public policy, those type of networks are used for very good things, like whistleblowers and people reporting anonymously about scandals, and for things that are a lot more questionable, such as selling drugs online. The problem is that bits are completely agnostic. A 0 is a 0 and a 1 is a 1. Doesn't matter if it's used to sell drugs or to actually help out dissidents. It's the same thing. But our students have an appreciation both for the technical side as well as the policy side. So at the end of the semester, when you're done with the security class, what do you see when you're presented with a ticket like this? For most people, this looks like a somewhat old but pretty ticket to the Magic Kingdom. You can visit exciting attractions. A security engineer doesn't see this. A security engineer sees this. Special type of paper, a unique serial number, and protections against photocopy. And the next thing that the security engineer asks is, I wonder if I could bypass those protections and get a free ride on one of those attractions. And if he can, or if she can, how do I fix this so that the amusement park is not losing money anymore? Security engineering is a mindset. It's perhaps a bit of a disease to see things only under this light of trying to break into systems. But it's also extremely interesting and I would say even exhilarating for people who are in this field. I would like to conclude this presentation by introducing also some of the research that we've been doing, which complements our teaching. And it complements our teaching because, again, we are looking at problems in a holistic manner, combining very computer science-ish, computer networking-oriented lines of research with things that are more from the social sciences side, such as economics. So let me give you this example. Everybody who's got an email address at some point or another received some spam for prescription drugs. And I wouldn't name brands, but Viagra is one of the most common ones. It's a potentially harmful type of online crime because there's a reason why prescription drugs require prescription, which is that take the wrong dosage and you may be in a lot of trouble. In fact, in the United States, a high school student by the name of Ryan Haidt ordered some painkillers because he had back pain, and somehow he didn't go through the regular channel of going to a doctor and then going to his local pharmacy. He bought some painkillers from some underground website and died of an overdose because the dosage was much higher than what it was supposed to be. At the same time, anytime you see a website that sells Viagra, it's actually supported by a very complex supply chain that is characteristic of a pretty complex online criminal ecosystem. And so our work in that space was about combining economics with network measurements, understanding how profits are made, understanding what the ecosystem looks like. To be able to do all of this, you need network measurements. So you need to have some people who can do the network measurements, which is very technical and very computer science oriented. You need people who can analyze the measurements, and there you need to bring in people who have an understanding of economics. Go in slightly more details. Whenever you see a pharmacy store, it's typically just the tip of the iceberg. There's a different entity which is in charge of bringing traffic to that website. A pharmacy store by itself can be as illicit as you want. If it doesn't have any traffic, it's not going to work. It's not going to make money. But the pharmacy store is also just a web front end. You actually need to get the drugs from somewhere when you're selling them. That's a different person. So there is somebody who is producing the drugs, there's somebody who is setting up a website for selling them, and that person relies on another entity to advertise for this website. That advertiser of sorts may resort to techniques like search engine manipulation and so forth, and to be able to do so requires himself, the rest of the infrastructure. So they may rely on botnets. Botnets themselves rely on people to actually implement malware somewhere else. So your small pharmacy store that is online probably couldn't exist if not for the works of a half dozen at least of different entities. What's the connection between those entities? Money. So service-based industry. It doesn't matter whether the goods that are being sold are illicit. What matters is that there's exchange of money for services. And so in research, we looked at trying to characterize those monetary flows, and we actually ran very large experiments over several years to try to understand not just what the ecosystem looks like, but also how it evolves over long periods of times, and what are the defenses that actually work. And at a very high level, some of the research results that we found from doing this analysis is that there's a number of pieces of this infrastructure that are actually extremely concentrated. And those are not the pharmacies. The pharmacy websites, there's thousands of those. If you try to take them down, it's very easy for them to just re-register another domain. We all know that. But what we were able to see is that parts of the advertising infrastructure, for instance, is essentially hosted on servers, and there's not that many such servers. And if you try to take those servers down, you may actually have a much stronger impact on that whole trend. So these are the type of things, these are the type of results that you can only get by doing a macro level view, if you will, study of this entire ecosystem. And that requires, again, a lot of measurements over a fairly long period of time. But the result is very satisfactory because in the end, you are able to say, well, this very, very complex, very, very large ecosystem has those two or three characteristics that we've been able to extract. And now we know how we can defend against such problems. To conclude, I hope I convinced you that security needs to be looked at in a holistic way. It's not just a matter of talking about technology. It's a combination of technology and social sciences. And we need experts that are able to go across domains. We need experts with very strong background in one specific domain, but that are able to talk different languages. I liken security engineering and information security in general as learning a foreign language. It's something that is useful only if people use it to communicate, and it's something that can only be mastered by complete immersion and constant immersion. I see security problems wherever I go, and so do our students after we've trained them. So again, security must be treated as an interdisciplinary science rather than the sum of disconnected and disjoint efforts. And failing to do so results in bad engineering. And we know about bad engineering when we see a bridge collapsing, for instance. The same thing is true in the context of information security. We need people who can actually put the different pieces together and understand them in a holistic manner. This is what we try to do through both teaching and research. And with this, I conclude, and I thank you very much for watching this video.